Welcome back. Now in this video, what I want to do is actually take you through setting up VPC endpoints in the AWS Management Console. We're actually going to set up a quick private VPC that's got absolutely no internet access whatsoever, and we're going to launch a EC2 instance in that VPC and then try and connect to it using endpoints. Let's do this. Okay, so let's take a look at the VPC endpoint architecture that we'll be setting up in order to demonstrate this lab exercise. So what I wanted to do is take a look at how the VPC is configured, but then also talk about the fact that we will be setting up an interface endpoint and a gateway endpoint and show you how to set those two up. The architecture is simple. We've got Holly over here that needs to access these two instances in a private VPC in private subnets. This VPC has no internet access whatsoever. No internet gateway, no NAT gateway, none of that stuff. And essentially what she needs is the ability to connect to these EC2 instances and have them connect to an S3 bucket. Now the S3 bucket is obviously in that region, or in terms of the buckets that she's going to be accessing is in that region. And we need to ensure that she can have these EC2 instances talk to that S3 service. So traditionally, if there was internet connectivity, she could use Session Manager or EC2 Connect, or even set up a Bastion host and all of that stuff. But we don't want any of that because of highly regulated requirements. So what she needs to do is to be able to access our EC2 environment using either the CLI or the web console. Because there's no internet access with this VPC, we need to set up something called an EC2 Instance Connect Endpoint Service API, which allows us to securely connect to our EC2 instance using the EC2 Instance Endpoint API service. Now, the EC2 Instance Connect Endpoint Service is an identity-aware TCP proxy. And the EC2 Instance Connect Endpoint Service establishes a private tunnel from your computer to the endpoint service using the credentials of your IAM entity. When it comes to using the console, that's fairly easy. With the CLI, just something to be aware of is that when you're making a CLI connection, you should ensure that you point your connection to the EC2 Instance Connect SSH service, specify the instance ID, and define the connection type as EC2 Instance Connect Endpoint. So that's the EICE endpoint. Now, once you configure the EC2 Instance Connect Endpoint service, what it does is it injects an ENI card into a subnet of your choice. And obviously you need to associate it with a security group that will allow inbound SSH access. You should also make sure that obviously these two instances are connected to the same security group or another security group. But at the end of the day, they should allow inbound access on the SSH protocol. Now, once you've got all of that in place, you will be able to use either the web console or the CLI service to connect to your EC2 instance via the EC2 Instance Connect Endpoint service. Okay, so that gives you access to your EC2 instances without your EC2 instances having public internet access. Once you're able to actually get to your EC2 instances, what you can obviously do is configure them to access the Amazon S3 service. Now here again, these EC2 instances would have required access to the internet, or at least an internet gateway, to be able to get to the public space of the AWS platform. Now, because that's not in place, we can go ahead and configure an S3 gateway endpoint and attach it to the VPC. Now, gateway endpoints do not make use of ENI cards or security groups, but instead, once you have established and configured this gateway endpoint, the S3 gateway endpoint for your VPC, you must configure the route tables so that they point to the gateway endpoint for any traffic that's going to go to the Amazon S3 service. Bear in mind that it is the S3 service in this specific region. Remember, with gateway endpoints, you cannot access services in other regions. It has to be in the same region as the gateway endpoint. Now that you've got that in place, there's still one more configuration you need to do. Remember, any resource that needs to access the resources of another service needs permissions to do so. And one way of doing that is assigning these EC2 instances with appropriate IAM roles so that they can connect to your S3 bucket. And so with all of that in place, you should now be able to access the S3 service via the S3 gateway endpoint. Right, that's exactly what we're going to be doing in the lab. So let's jump into the AWS Management Console. Okay, so here we are in my AWS Management Console. This is my development account and we are in the London region. I'm also within the VPC dashboard, which, as you know, we have the Richards VPC in. Now, here's the thing. We're not going to be using this VPC because this is for our capstone project. We're going to create a brand new VPC and we want to create a private VPC. I'm going to call this one Sandbox VPC. Okay. and we're going to give it a CIDR block of 10.1.0.0/16, and we're going to scroll all the way down and click create VPC. So that's our VPC getting created there. Now what we need to do is add some subnets. So we're going to add subnets to our sandbox VPC. Going to call the first one sandbox private sub 01. Okay, we're going to put that in EUS2A, and we're going to give the subnet a CIDR of 10.1.1.0/24. Okay, create another subnet. So this is going to be our second subnet, and this is going to be private sub 02. That's going to go in availability zone EUS2B with a CIDR block of 10.1.2.0/24. Okay, so that's our two subnets. So they're two private subnets across two availability zones. Okay, so if we take a look at route tables next, you'll see that there's a route table created for it already, which is the main route table that is attached to every single new VPC that you create, which is this one over here, this fourth one over here, the sandbox VPC. So I'm just going to call this one sandbox main RT, just so that we know what it is. And if you take a look at the routes in there, currently there's just a single route, which is the local route for local traffic to flow through. Fantastic. Okay, so one more thing we need to do is we can create a security group. Okay, so click create a security group, and we're going to call this one the sandbox app SG for sandbox application security group. We need to obviously give it a description, so we're just going to paste the same thing in there. Put it in the right VPC. For inbound rules, you just want to make sure that you enable SSH. Okay, and that let it come from anywhere. Okay, so the 40/0 means any external network or any network. Okay, and let's scroll a bit further down and then click create security group. Okay, so that's our security group created. Okay, so now that we've got all of our VPC settings in place, we need to go ahead and deploy an EC2 instance. We're going to deploy the EC2 instance in the private subnet. So that's the sandbox private subnet 1 of the sandbox VPC. Let's do that next. Okay, so we're going to be deploying an instance, and I'm going to launch an instance. And so we're going to name this one sandbox instance 01. It's going to be a Linux based instance, right, using the Linux 2023 AMI. We're going to go for the T2 micro because that is eligible for free tier. Then we're not going to attach any key pairs to it. Okay, and the network settings, you want to make sure you place it in the right VPC. So that's a sandbox VPC, and we're putting this first one in the private sub 01. Okay, it doesn't need a public IP address because it is a private subnet and a private instance, but I'm going to attach that security group I just created for it, sandbox app SG. Scrolling a bit further down, when I go to advanced details, I'm going to leave everything else as it is. Okay, and click launch instance. Right, that's going to take a couple of minutes to fully launch, so it's currently in the pending state. I'm going to pause the video over here, and once it's all done, I'm going to come back and continue where we left off. Okay, so that's our sandbox instance now all up and running. Now, if we were to actually try and attempt to connect to the sandbox instance, we'll find that we won't be able to, because you've got EC2 Instance Connect, which allows you to connect to your EC2 instances without those key pairs and without opening SSH ports, but only if you have a public IP address. And that is your standard connect to an EC2 Instance Connect from a browser-based client with a public IPv4 or IPv6 address. Okay. Previously, we've had a look at Session Manager. Obviously, Session Manager is not going to work because Session Manager requires you to connect to the System Manager services, which either requires you to have a NAT gateway and Internet gateway configured or endpoints. Now, we haven't set up any endpoints yet, so that isn't going to work either. I still want to use Instance Connect though, and there is an option to connect to your EC2 instance using an EC2 Instance Connect endpoint. That will allow you to use private IPv4 addressing and a VPC endpoint to connect to your instance, so you don't need public access on your VPC. Now, if you select that, you're going to obviously have to select an endpoint. Now we have not created an endpoint yet, so we can go back into a VPC and create the endpoint, or we can just click on this link, which will bring it up in another browser window. So now we're going to create an interface endpoint, which is what an EC2 Instance Connect endpoint is. It's an elastic network interface that allows you to connect to resources in a private subnet. We'll give this a name. I'll call this one Sandbox EC2 Endpoint. And just so that we know what it is, I'm going to call it interface. And you want to select the EC2 Instance Connect endpoint. Okay. Which VPC are we putting it in? Well, the Sandbox VPC, obviously. And if you take a look at additional settings, there's an option to preserve client IP. But this basically means that you're trying to ensure that the EC2 Instance Connect will support client IP preservation. So the way how this works is when you connect with your client, obviously you advertise a client IP address that is being used as the incoming address to your instances when you connect to them. Or if you leave that unticked, what it does is it actually advertises or showcases the IP address of the EC2 Instance Connect interface instead, which is where we're going to leave it at. Next, you scroll down and you need to attach a security group because it is an interface endpoint, so it needs a security group attached to it. We'll attach the same Sandbox App SG security group. And which subnet are you going to put this EC2 instance in? Well, we're going to put it in the private subnet 1. Now, here's the thing. You only need to actually put this interface endpoint in one of the subnets in your VPC for it to work across the subnets, across the availability zones. And I'll show you how that works subsequently. So next, we're going to click Create Endpoint. And that will create the interface endpoint for us. It does take a couple of minutes to set up. So I'm going to pause the video over here. And once it's done, we're going to come back and check it out. Okay, so that's our interface endpoint up and running. The status is available. So all I need to do is go back to my instances. I'll click on the Sandbox Instance 1 and then click Connect. And then within the EC2 Instance Connect option, select Connect using EC2 Instance Connect endpoint. So select that one. And the endpoint is this endpoint over here. So that's the 5D0. I know that because if I take a look at the endpoint ID, there it is, DE50. So DE50, that one. So that's my endpoint. I'm logging in with the username EC2 user and I'll click Connect. Okay, so we should now be connecting to an instance in a private subnet of a private VPC with no internet access. And there we are. We're logged in just fine. So I can do a sudo su and I can do a pwd to see where I am. And I can do a yum update -y. And obviously that will not work because it doesn't have any internet access. Okay, but let's come out of this. We can access the instance nonetheless. Okay, so if I do a ping google.com, that isn't going to work either. You're going to see that's going to time out. Again, it's got no internet access whatsoever, but I can connect to the instance using the EC2 instance endpoint. Now, one of the things that I want to be able to do with this instance is access my S3 buckets privately. So if I do an AWS S3 ls to list out all of my buckets, okay, so it comes up with an error message saying unable to look at credentials. You can configure credentials by running AWS configure. Now, the reason why it's coming up with this is because it doesn't have access to Amazon S3. So the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to just come out of that, cancel that. Let's go to our instance and let's give it some permissions to actually access S3. We could use AWS configure or we could use an IAM role, which is the better option. So I'm going to go into IAM and open that up in another tab. And this is my IAM dashboard, and we're going to go ahead and create a new role. So let's click create a role, AWS service, and it's for an EC2 instance that we're creating the role. And the permissions I'm going to attach to it is just give it full Amazon S3 access. Okay. Obviously you can be granular, and we'll call this one Sandbox EC2 to S3 role, just so that I can easily identify it, and then click create role. So that is my role created. So all I need to do is go back to instances, go back to my EC2 instance and make a modification. Now, if you click your instance and go to actions and go down to security, you can modify the IAM role of the instance. So currently there is no role attached to the instance. I'm going to attach the Sandbox EC2 S3 role and update IAM role. Okay, so that part is done. So now this instance has got access, full access to Amazon S3. So if I click connect again, use my endpoint, select the endpoint and connect to it. do you believe that I'm going to be able to access S3 now? Well, let's test it out. So sudo su AWS S3 ls, and the answer is no. We're not going to be able to access S3 because although the EC2 instance has permission to access S3, there is no route to the S3 platform. Okay, we don't have a NAT gateway, we don't have an internet gateway, we have an endpoint, but the endpoint is only for our EC2 instance connect service, not for Amazon S3. So let's come out of this. Okay, and I'll terminate that window as well. Let's get rid of the IAM role as well. And what we're going to do is create another endpoint. So we're going to go to our VPC, scroll down to endpoints, which is there. Let's get rid of that and click refresh. Okay, so there is my EC2 instance connect endpoint. This time we're going to create another endpoint. We're going to call this one sandbox EC2 S3 endpoint. And we're going to create a gateway endpoint. Okay, so select AWS service, scroll down, and under services, just search for S3. The one that you want is the one that needs to match your region name and specifically the S3 service. So that's S3 and specifically EU West 2, which is the London region S3. So that's what we want. And we want a gateway endpoint, not an interface endpoint for this one, because I want to show you how that works. And then under VPC, make sure you select the right VPC, so the sandbox VPC. Now, with gateway endpoints, you don't set up ENI, so you don't set up DNS, you use route tables. So we're going to update the main route table, which is attached to the subnets where my instance reside. And this is where you can also define an endpoint policy to control exactly what you're going to allow through that endpoint. I'm going to allow full access for now. Scroll a bit further down and click create gateway endpoint. And we've got our gateway endpoint created. So if we take a look at route tables for a second, it's updated the main route table. I want to show you the route that it added. There you go. It's added a route to this prefix, right, with the target of the endpoint. So if we click on this prefix, you will see that it is com Amazon AWS EU West 2, the S3 platform. And it's got all of those IPs that are part of the prefix for Amazon S3. Okay, fantastic. So what that means is I should be able to go to my EC2 instance, click on the sandbox instance 1, click connect using the endpoint, select my endpoint, and then click connect. Okay, so now I'm connecting to my EC2 instance, and there we are. Okay, where am I? I am currently in the home EC2 user directory, and if I do an AWS S3 ls, there you go. I've got the list of all of my buckets showing up. Okay, so I can now access my Amazon S3 bucket. I can create buckets, delete buckets because I've got full access files, and all of that stuff. Fantastic. Let's do one more thing. So let's create another instance. So creating another instance, we'll click the launch instance button, and let's call this one sandbox instance 02. And that's going to be the Amazon Linux 2023. Same instance type, no need for key pairs. We'll go to network settings, make sure we put it in the sandbox VPC. This time I want it in the private sub 02. No need for public IP addresses. Select the right security group, sandbox app SG. Scroll a bit further down, and this time I'm going to remember to attach the right instance profile or the IAM role, which is that one. Sandbox EC2 S3 role, and launch the instance. Right, that's going to take a couple of minutes to launch. Let's just go in and do a refresh, and there it is. It's initializing. I'll pause the video here and come back once it's done. Okay, and that's our instance up and running and launch. So let's connect to this instance now. So click connect, and we're going to do the connect endpoint, and I'm going to use the same endpoint, and then I'm going to click connect. So we should be able to connect to this instance, which we can. And let's just see whether now we can also access S3 because we've given it the same IAM role. And there it is. We can access Amazon S3 because it's got permissions. It's using the gateway endpoint for S3, and I'm connected to the instance using the EC2 Connect endpoint. Right, that pretty much covers all of this lab. So let's very quickly terminate everything so that you don't get charged unnecessarily. So back to my EC2 instance, I'm going to terminate these two instances. We need to do that first. Let's get rid of those. Okay, that's going to take a few moments to terminate. I'll pause the video over here and come back once it's all done. Okay, so now our EC2 instances have terminated. Okay, and we can see that it's all terminated. So the next thing what we want to do is also get rid of those endpoints. Okay, so on your VPC dashboard, you want to go down to endpoints, and there are those two endpoints. So we get rid of this one, delete. Okay, and then we get rid of the interface endpoint as well, delete. And those are our endpoints getting deleted. Takes a couple of minutes for the interface endpoint to get deleted. I'll pause the video over here. Okay, so we've successfully deleted our endpoints, and obviously we no longer have our EC2 instances. Let's just get rid of those. Let's also tidy up our IAM role. We don't need that IAM role anymore. So let's go into roles, and we'd called it the sandbox role. So let's get rid of that role. Roles don't cost you anything, but it's always a good idea to just get rid of them just to tidy things up. Okay, and also it's a security measure. Right, so that's gone, that's gone. We can now go back to our VPC and get rid of our sandbox VPC. So under actions, delete sandbox VPC, and it should come up all green, which means nothing is tying it up in any way, and click delete, and that's deleting our VPC. Right, that's all done, and that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you. I'll see you folks in the next.